Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for attending the final session of our student speaker series on international security from a South Asian perspective. Thank you very much, Samir, to present your work today to us. It's really a great honor to have you present here. Thank you also to CCSA for hosting us and for having these series. It's really been terrific so far. So let me briefly introduce Samir. So Samir Lalwani is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center and an affiliate of the for International Relations at MIT. He previously served as a Stanton Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellow at the RAND Corporation. Samir earned his PhD from the Department of Political Science at MIT, and he holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. So today, Samir will be presenting or talking to us about his talk entitled The Second Coming, Testing the Nuclear Revolution in Pakistan's Strategic Debates. So just to, for the order of the day, Samir will talk to us for about 45 to 50 minutes. Then we will open it up for Q&A. You can ask questions either by raising your hand, which you can find in the participants section of Zoom, or by typing your question in the chat directed at Binish Parvez, who is my co-host and my colleague and who will be leading the Q&A section today. So Samir, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for hosting me and giving me this opportunity to present this. I really regret that I wasn't able to get up to Providence to do this in person before the pandemic hit. And I thought that that would allow me, several months to prepare, for this presentation a lot more. Unfortunately, as things go, this just gets displaced to the last minute. And so I'm going to present what is still very much a work in progress. It's forcing functions like this that have helped me move this project along, but it's sort of been on the back burner, for at times for years. And so I am looking forward to being able to get sort of a first take at an assessment from and feedback from all my colleagues here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put this presentation up. Okay, so I'm still working on this title. It's not my favorite one. It was sort of like a slapdash title thrown together before an APSA presentation. So we'll call it Second Coming, Testing the Nuclear Revolution in Pakistan Strategic Debates. By Second Coming, what it meant really was that, like, we're in the second nuclear age. There's a re-engagement of the discussion of the nuclear revolution in two ways. One is there's sort of a lot of retrospective re-evaluation of what it is that the superpowers during the Cold War believed and how they behaved during the Cold War. But the other part of this being the sort of the second nuclear age is that there are a whole bunch of other regional powers that are wrestling with similar dilemmas and challenges and opportunities with nuclear weapons. And so part of this objective is really just to sort of bring to light what it is that other states, how they wrestled with these questions of a nuclear revolution, how they thought about it, and what empirical evidence, if any, that we can find on it. So it started more as sort of an empirical sort of exploration, and you'll see this is a little less theoretically motivated than it is empirical, but I would welcome suggestions on how to make it speak to some of the theoretical debates that are ongoing today. So, I won't belabor this because I'm sure everyone in the room knows this better than I, but, the work by Robert Jervis was pretty important, as a capstone for, I think, a lot of realist scholars who were talking about what it meant what nuclear weapons meant for security and political affairs and foreign policy behavior during the Cold War and after. I think there's a really elegant summary, by Brendan Green and Austin Long that really drew me into this. But they were sort of summarizing not just Jervis's propositions, but Ken Waltz and Charlie Glazer and a number of other scholars who have all contributed to this body of work. And essentially the implication, I think, is summarized really well in this paragraph, that many nuclear theorists hold that secure second strike forces revolutionize military and political affairs. Previously dominant military factors like the balance of power or clever strategies for force employment cease to be politically relevant, since winning a military exchange cannot save states from utter destruction. Competition becomes a test of nerves rather than strength, with each state attempting to demonstrate its resolve rather than its power. Instead of intentional escalation to win a military victory, states compete by taking risks that might cause inadvertent escalation, threatening a nuclear Armageddon that neither side intends. Most deterrence theorists contend that competitions and risk-taking favor the defender of the status quo, ameliorating the security dilemma and stabilizing world politics. So there's a lot of contentions and propositions within that paragraph, and I will try to unpack that. But essentially, the question for me is, how, if at all, does Pakistan grapple with this question? So over the last 5-10 years or so, I think there's been a lot of debate about sort of the proposition of the nuclear revolution that was taken sort of for, I wouldn't say for granted, but generally accepted wisdom for a period of time. And there have been a lot of critiques or challenges to it, and both in the empirical and theoretical assumptions of it. And they come from, a lot of work by Brendan Green and Austin Long, but also Keir Lieber and Darrell Press. The critiques, I would say, distill down to, the stalemate idea that sort of precondition is not actually easy, nor is it durable or deterring of all levels of war, that misperception and status quo ambiguity fuel competition, even when you do have stalemate. And then empirically, this is where I think that it was like the driver of a lot of this work, is that both the US and the USSR are routinely found through, declassified documents, archival work, making attempts to escape mutually assured destruction on a regular basis. And there's a consistent pursuit of relative games, arms racing, and competition, and that persists not only historically, but at present. And so I think that different scholars sort of take on different pieces of that, but that, I would say, is a summation of the critiques. There's a set of responses that there's more out there, but the ones that sort of capture that, regardless of the actual empirical behavior, there is something to the fact that leaders really did believe this. Craig and Radichenko have documented this really well, about particularly Soviet leaders like Khrushchev, really did sort of take this to heart. Joseph Terigian has a paper that he's working on looking at how they tried to implement this, and there was sort of significant struggles between sort of the beliefs by executive leaders in the USSR, but then actually implementing this in the bureaucracy and the military organizations. But nevertheless, there's a commitment to those beliefs, and these beliefs matter because I think, as Josh Rovner elegantly summarizes sort of these debates really well, in peacetime, you can have a lot of deviations from the predictions of the nuclear revolution, but in crisis time, in wartime, you saw leaders routinely revert back to this idea that it was impossible to win a nuclear war, and eschewing sort of even the risk-taking that might be engendered even under mutually assured destruction. So that, I think, is sort of a useful summary of the debates. I think an open question here is, where do regional powers with nuclear weapons fit in? How do they approach this? On the one hand, there should be a lot more uncertainty because of smaller arsenals. But on the other hand, they also have limited resources to achieve some sort of escape from nuclear stalemate. And there's a lot of work, I think, that's been done on the behavior of regional powers. I mean, there's a sort of Renaissance work on sort of nuclear doctrine and strategy, particularly like in the area I deal with South Asia, so India and Pakistan. A lot of that work comes out of Vipin Narang and his students. But there's less work that's been done on the belief systems, right? On sort of the worldviews within sort of the ambit of nuclear weapons. Of a lot of these countries. And part of that is just the limitations on what data and information you can get, right? So this great work in the nuclear revolution debate has been taking place because of declassified archival material. That's pretty limited or rare. There's some of it that's starting to happen. I mean, there's great work by Yogesh Joshi on sort of Indian nuclear strategy and thinking, but certainly with the case of Pakistan, it's far more limited. There is really no archival material. A few people who are sort of given access to the archives, it's sort of an ad hoc basis, it's not systematic. And so that sort of drives me to, my inquiry and like what I want to do with testing this proposition with Pakistan. So Pakistan is known for some fairly problematic strategic assessment issues, not only in crises, but in peacetime. And yet nuclear weapons have been central to its national security and grand strategy. So on the one hand, it's been criticized for a lack of sophisticated strategic thinking, learning, or adaptation or creative thinking. And on the other hand, it seems that nuclear weapons are really central to the way it thinks about its security. And so you would expect that there should have been some, some wrestling with these propositions of the nuclear revolution. So the questions I sort of approached, as I said, are fairly empirical. What did Pakistan make of political military effects of nuclear weapons? And did it internalize what we believe to be, the ostensible lessons of the nuclear revolution? So as I said, that there's been a lot of work done on behavior, particularly on sort of Pakistani strategic behavior under the nuclear umbrella by Paul Kapoor and Feroz Khan, Vipin Durang, Naeem Salek. And there's been some work on beliefs, although the amount of that work on beliefs that sort of relates to nuclear weapons is still quite small. So Steve Cohen has a chapter of it in one of his books. Chris Fair has a chapter, one of her books. Dave Smith has a chapter sort of within a recent monograph on sort of Pakistan nuclear, or sort of Pakistan sort of strategic and military's strategic thinking. And then there's a recent paper in the Washington Quarterly by Sadia Taslim and Toby Dalton that's sort of also exploring this. But I would situate my work more in sort of this beliefs category. I think there's a lot of evidence you can amass on the behavioral side, but if we found that there was just sort of little engagement with these ideas to begin with, or little subscription to the nuclear revolution propositions, then you shouldn't expect any behavior to emulate some of that stabilizing sort of predictions of the theory. And so I do think the beliefs are prior, and it's important to investigate whether any of those beliefs or ideas were considered and taken seriously. So the data that I'll be talking about for a little bit first is, and the methods that are employed to do this, it's a little bit different. So what we did was we collected, and by we I mean myself and some colleagues at Stimson. I've had a team working on this for a while, and it's a much larger project, collecting this corpus of strategic journals from Pakistan, and then employing structural topic modeling to study this corpus. So this has taken sort of quite a long time. These journals are not impossible, but fairly difficult to access, and to, especially in sort of a single place. They haven't been sort of amassed in a central location. They haven't been digitized. So we had a big process of doing that. And then that enables what I'll describe as sort of the structural topic modeling process with sort of semi-automated textual analysis, but then also enabling really a qualitative analysis. So to start with, I think the strategic literature is a fairly credible set of sources to rely on. As I said, there's not archival material or archival data that you can get access to on Pakistan's strategic decision making. So I think this is like the closest proxy we have to it. The publishers of these materials are, come from military institutions like the General Headquarters, National Defense University, their Command and Staff College, as well as a number of government-backed think tanks, but backed by the Foreign Ministry, the intelligence services. And so that's where we sort of collect this batch of about 15 different strategic journals, and collect materials all the way back to 1948. The authors of these publications there are a lot of military officers. I'd say it's about 50-50 between military and civilian. Most of the civilian authors tend to be involved in strategic establishment, as I said, either in the think tank community or professors at some of these military institutions. But you do get a fair number of people from the military, and as I said, 50%, but a high number of flag officers. People go on to become corps commanders and heads of the ISI. You have some experts dating back to Steve Cohen who talking about how important and valuable these materials are. That the context in which they appear, the audience to which they're addressed are particularly important. I think Christine Fair has gone as far as to say that this reflects an evolving conversation within the institution, the epistemic community. These documents offer a pristine glimpse, untainted by a desire to influence external audiences, into how the Army understands its strategic environment and what options are best to manage it. And I would expand that to say not just the Army, but the military, because there are journals we've gotten from the Air Force, like Shaheen, as well as the Navy. And then I think the strategic community writ large sort of expands beyond the actual military institutions themselves, particularly on nuclear weapons, as there's sort of a lot of political considerations as opposed to purely tactical or military ones. And for one example, I just point to you is that we found this really remarkable article by Brigadier Ahmed Shuja Pasha in the 1998 issue of Pakistan Defense Review. And Shuja Pasha becomes famous because he goes on to become the head of the ISI from 2008 to 2012, and famously was sort of kind of forced to take the fall for the discovery of bin Laden during the 2011 operation. But he was a pretty significant figure in the Pakistan military. And he writes this remarkable article in 1998 detailing what it means immediately after the nuclear test by India and Pakistan, what it means for strategy and war fighting, and even sort of the consideration of tactical nuclear weapons. So what I'm doing is just to say that these are not just whistles in the wind. These are pretty serious considerations and debates. I don't believe that this is all fully, the kind of smoking gun speech evidence that Steve Avery would say sort of is like, allows you to sort of have really strong qualitative evidence, but I think it's really strong suggestive evidence. And it's important that we consider how they're discussing this, because for the most part, until very recently, these are closed discussions. As someone, I think a journalist described it as, this is the military talking to itself, the strategic establishment talking to itself. And so it reveals a lot about, whether they even sort of think about the questions we're going to raise about the nuclear revolution or not. So describe after the data, so just let me talk about the methods employed for this. So we employ what we call topic modeling, not what we call, sorry. This is sort of borrowed by a lot of other scholarship on semi-automated textual analysis. There's some other terms I'm just forgetting, escaping my mind, but essentially like acknowledging that text as data is a useful, and it can be measured and studied in a very different way than sort of just purely reading the material for itself. There's latent structure within text data, right? So it allows us to quantify the salience and sentiment over time of particular texts or corpuses. But it also allows for really is a powerful sifting device for qualitative analysis. And let me give you a quick example of this, right? So we started out with roughly 11,000 articles that were collected over the course of 70 years, or from a sort of period of 70 years. Of that, we find sort of the densest and most diverse sort of batch to be sort of the period from 1977 to 2017. So it's about 6,500 articles. Once we run some of the modeling on it, we can identify articles that have a strong sort of elements of a nuclear topic, or we would assign to the sort of as nuclear oriented articles. So already we've cut down sort of our work to about 10%, or much more than that, 10% of sort of that sort of previous batch. And then from there, we're able to sort of do another model on it again to assess sort of within the nuclear topics, the articles that focus specifically on strategy and doctrine. So from 11,000, we've gone down to 120 articles, which is a much more manageable way to study this problem, because otherwise you sort of have, some pretty random errors in like what you're missing or capturing in this, or looking to things like titles or abstracts, which are sort of they're inexact in terms of capturing whether the topic of nuclear issues sort of really gets discussed within it. So it's, as I said, it's a pretty powerful qualitative tool that enables qualitative analysis, and that's most of what I'm going to present to you today. And it's going to be far less quantitative assessments. So as I said, this is a journal of 11,000 articles, or a corpus of 11,000 articles, 15 journals over the course of 70 years. I'm not going to go into great depth on this, but just for a summary of what structural topic modeling is, it involves number one, this corpus of cleaned articles that sort of with optical character recognition text. That process in of itself takes a long time if you're not starting out with that. Most of the work that's done in this field tends to sort of start from digitized literature. So that part of the process is already done. I would say this is sort of akin to like archival work, where there's a lot more work put into the back end of simply collection and treatment of it prior to analysis. Combining that with sort of a bag of words, which is sort of identifies what's going to be the salient terms in our term document matrix, and then combining that with metadata for each of our units of analysis, which would be articles, that allows us to sort of produce topic models or to model the topics in a variety of ways depending on how we specify the parameters. In this case, again, for simplicity's sake, we'll say we use a 10 topic model on this on this large corpus of 6,500 articles. And the one I want to point to is that we generate a topic which we labeled nuclear proliferation and strategy. And after that, because this is a mixed membership model, we took not only the articles that sort of had the highest register of that topic, but also articles whose sort of second highest topic was nuclear proliferation and strategy and batched them together and sort of created a new corpus. And from that, we sort of did a second model, a 10-topic model on that, what we call sort of that nuclear topic. And then again here, the one that that I try to drill down on really specifically in this paper is this nuclear strategy and doctrine topic, which seems to be the dominant topic within this new corpus. And it becomes dominant actually only in very recent years. So this is a distribution of all these nuclear articles from 77 to 2017. You see it's pretty, there's not sort of like particularly one period which is higher or lower, but when it comes to the strategy and doctrine articles, they really take off in the you could say the post-nuclear era, like after the 1998 test, when there's an overt nuclear capability that Pakistan has. This is when that discourse really starts to take or pick up. And I think that's when you get a lot of debates again about sort of the political efficacy and utility of nuclear weapons, and not simply just the discussion of proliferation and access and things like that. Okay, so that was a very long description of the methods for this, but let me now sort of go into the propositions, breaking down the propositions of the nuclear revolution and then assessing them within the literature that I've talked about. So I would break down the propositions to 3.5 propositions. This is really drawing from Brendan Green's work. I think he does an excellent job of distilling sort of the essential ideas, because there's a lot of overlap between them, but these are kind of, you can say they're sort of quasi-distinct propositions. So the first is that bargaining occurs through competitions in risk-taking and signaling, not full-scale war. So it's major scale war is not necessary to sort of resolve competitions or disputes or distributions of power. It's the competition risk taking when you have nuclear weapons. The second is that the balance of resolve favors the defender of the status quo. The third is that nuclear stalemate renders strategic or conventional advantage meaningless. So that means things like arms racing should be less useful or maybe not useful at all. And an unspecified precondition that sort of is a starting point for most of this literature, but I think we need to sort of make clear up front, is that there is the existence of mutually assured destruction that entails a secure second strike, and that is both evident and entrenched. And I think Keir Lieber and Daryl Press start to challenge this a little bit. But this proposition, you could say, was largely acceptable for the Cold War superpowers, right? With arsenals of like tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, you can be fairly confident about secure second strike. This assumption has to be much more relaxed when it comes to regional nuclear powers. They're dealing in tens and sometimes hundreds of nuclear weapons, or 800 if that much. And so then that assumption of secure second strike really needs to be questioned, but we'll get to that a little bit later. In summary, though, as it says from the opening quotes, that nuclear revolution is supposed to mitigate the security dilemma, dampen arms races, and create political and military stability. So it's within each of these propositions, you can unpack some of the observables that we can look for in the Pakistan strategic literature. So for the first one about competition through risk-taking, not war, we should expect observable expressions of major war or nuclear war being unwinnable, the impossibility of conquest or territorial conquest at least, and that a much greater importance assigned to signaling over actual war fighting. For the second proposition, the balance of resolve favors the status quo. We should expect observable expressions of defense having the advantage, that revisionist or revanchist goals are just no longer tenable in the post-nuclear environment, and that the security dilemma has been mitigated in some way. The third proposition that if stalemate renders strategic or conventional advantage meaningless, then we should expect observable expressions that arms races are unnecessary, that there should be an openness to arms control, a confidence in deterrent stability, and a suggestion for changes in the military, including nuclear substitution for conventional forces, for cost efficiency, to reduce spending, changes in procurement and force structure, and even force employment. Okay, so taking all those propositions, and I'll continue to sort of bring those back up again, I'm just going to dive into the literature a little bit and show you what I've found, which is, again, I'm starting with a fairly low bar. I'm not yet sure if I'm able to say comprehensively if this is sort of an established belief within this literature. I mean, there's a lot of sort of constraints on sort of what I can say that we'd unearthed from this literature, but I think it's important to recognize, A, if they are even engaging with these discussions, and B, if there's any sort of indication that they subscribe to the same propositions that are ostensibly, either sort of held by superpowers or by Western powers, about what nuclear weapons do or do not confer. So on this question of nuclear weapons, risk-taking and not war, and nuclear war being unwinnable, there's actually a lot of evidence that policymakers and officers were thinking very seriously about this. So Colonel Anwar in the Green Book, and at this time he is serving officer in the GHQ's Doctrine and Evaluation branch, says that as there are no victors in nuclear war, it's imaginable there would be devastation. How much devastation would be seen if both Pakistan and India are to unleash the nuclear weapons against each other, and in what manner? The quantification of this mutually assured destruction cannot be measured against any available model. Zulfikar Khan, who's a scholar and professor at National Defense University, says it's no longer possible to expect victory in a nuclear environment because under the nuclear overhang, the only logical policy is to prevent war instead of conceiving a dogma to win it. And Lieutenant General Durrani, who is the head of ISI in the early 90s, continues to be a contributor to the scholarship, writes the defense against nuclear attack was effective only if it was foolproof. Even one missile that got through could do unacceptable damage. So this seems to be pretty convincingly recognizing that there's no way to win a nuclear war. That's maybe like a fairly low bar to clear, but nevertheless, it's important that we're discussing that and establish that. On the question of conquest, again, you see a lot of evidence suggesting that they recognize that conquest is not possible. Nuclear deterrence, this is Lieutenant Colonel Mahmood in the National Defense College Journal before it becomes National Defense University. He writes that nuclear deterrence in Pakistan's stated policy of first use in case its vital national interests are threatened have placed a severe restriction on Indian design of waging an all-out conventional war against Pakistan. By the very definition, another country cannot be captured, nor would it be possible to destroy the military power of the adversary. Brigadier Javed in the Green Book in 2011 seems to also subscribe to this. He says that each side must accept the consequences of conflict are unacceptable, that neither side must attempt to use the fear of nuclear war to coerce favorable territorial and political concessions, and both countries should avoid initiating or escalating bilateral crisis. So the idea of not just simply conquest, but be able to coerce territorial gains or changes seems to be an idea out there. Lieutenant Colonel Fayaz writes in Citadel, which is the Command and Staff College Journal, that we need to ask ourselves whether national cohesion or integrity is threatened by a loss of a chunk of territory. Decision makers should not keep in mind that territory loss is retrievable through negotiations, but that the lives lost in the but not the lives lost in the process. So I think there's fairly consistent evidence both for the unwinnability of war and sort of the inability to pursue conquest. And then there's this question of signaling versus warfighting, which there's a little less discussion of, but there's some indications. Actually, in a U.S. Naval War College review, Commander Khan writes that the role of armed forces was once to win a war if diplomacy failed. In the nuclear age, the role is now to prevent war from breaking out. And so that suggests at least that sort of the war fighting sort of utility of the military is much more constrained, and therefore, deterrence, I think, is really a function of signaling. So he's gesturing in that direction. Asad Durrani again also writes that it's much more likely, in fact, that because of the risks of a major conflict, both India and Pakistan would carefully contain their conflicts to the tactical level. Strategic stability therefore remains technically in place. And by that, it suggests to me that there's going to be tactical maneuvers for the purpose of signaling, but again, not for the purpose of winning or major war fighting. So overall, I think that there's strong evidence to suggest that that this idea that political competition or competition with nuclear weapons is reduced to risk-taking, but not actual all-out war, is one that's generally accepted by the Pakistan military. There's a plot that I'm still sort of trying to figure out how to present this better, but essentially when we did some search terms within this narrower corpus of nuclear articles, you find that on average, deterrence seems to prevail as sort of a more salient concept than victory or winning. There's this weird spike in 2003. I think that's because there was a particular journal that sort of asked sort of what the definition of victory was. But for the most part, it seems to suggest that deterrence, particularly sort of after 1998, deterrence is a more useful concept than victory or winning. But this sort of sentiment analysis, I think, sort of requires a little more depth that I haven't been able to do right now. One other thought I thought was really useful is to think about if the proposition is that we're in a world not of war fighting, but of signaling, this makes the world a lot more political, right? That the importance of politics and the political effects of nuclear weapons are much more important than the actual material or war-fighting effects. I think there's a great line from 13 Days when McNamara, I mean, it's from the film 13 Days, where McNamara is talking to an admiral and basically saying that, like, what's happening here, and the admiral thinks that sort of, by firing across the bow of a ship, that was sort of an important rules of engagement requirements, and McNamara chastises him and basically says that, like, what's happening here is that the president and the Premier Khrushchev are actually speaking to each other. They're communicating in a entirely new language, right? And that's a political language rather than one about sort of actual material effects, and that suggests sort of an attention to what political communication looks like. And on average, I think it's safe to say that civilians sort of have a better understanding of that than military organizations. I think it's borne out by some of the literature on sort of military preferences for the offensive rather than, for example, deterrence or punishment strategies. And what you find that when you look at the distribution of like the writers on the nuclear issues within Pakistan is that over time, civilians, particularly sort of, in a period prior to actual nuclear weapons possession, and the period sort of after some learning after the nuclear tests, that civilians sort of have an outsized share of this discourse as opposed to the military officers. And there might be some other reasons for that, but I think one plausible explanation is that there's a recognition that deterrence concepts and sort of the ideas that underpin sort of the political effects, civilians have an expertise in this in a way that the military doesn't. And it's striking, particularly because the sample here is not all writings across the board. It's specifically strategic journals that are curated mostly by the military institutions or the strategic establishment. And yet, on the nuclear topic, there's a lot more civilian discourse driving it than military authorship. So on the second question, or the second contention about to resolve favoring the defender of the status quo. So as I said, there's several propositions. One of them is a defensive advantage. And again, you see some recognition of this. Air Commodore Jamal Hussein, writing in Citadel, basically says the balance of interests makes clear that the balance of resolve, which guarantees that defensive threats will work. And essentially saying that deterrence will hold even if India sort of has some sort of belief about first strike advantage. There's literature later on that sort of suggests otherwise, that that there's still great fears about Indian first strike capabilities, but there's at least some who cling to this idea that there's a defensive advantage with nuclear weapons. On the question of revisionism or revanchism being possible, so the big piece of evidence that often gets used or invoked against Pakistan's acceptance of this is the Kargil War, right, which was an attempt to seize territory. There's a whole bunch of new literature, I'd say, in the last 10 years that really sort of raises questions about what the intentional strategy was behind that, and some of the problems of strategic assessment and coordination and organizational pathologies. But nevertheless, after the Kargil War, there's a lot of discussion about what Pakistan has learned about that, whether revisionism is or is not possible. So in the post-Kargil situation, it's essential that the governments of India and Pakistan to respect the sanctity of the line of control and discourage activities which aim to arbitrarily change the territorial status quo and take concrete steps between the two countries, that no side will alter territorial status quo by force. Another scholar writes in the National Defense College Journal that Pakistan would also need to recognize the continuation of its Kashmir-centered foreign policy is simply not tenable. And later on, another Lieutenant Colonel Safdar writes in Citadel that Pakistan's experimentation with limited war not only failed, but may also dissuade to make a similar attempt in the future. So a recognition of sort of the defensive advantage or status quo advantage in the balance of resolve. This is a distribution of a plot that sort of shows the distribution of articles discussing Kashmir under the nuclear shadow. So again, within this narrower corpus of nuclear topic articles, we looked at sort of the discussions of this topic. And while there is a spike in the sort of the post nuclear acquisition but pre-overt test phase from 1990 to 1998, that starts to level up and then decline post 2008, 2010. This is sort of a cleaner curve. So what I would take from this is that I think there's a period of time when Pakistani scholars and strategists were thinking that there was something that nuclear weapons could be used in a particular way to achieve certain political ends of either sort of territorial aggrandizement or resolution of Kashmir, but that seems to start to diminish as the salience of Kashmir as a topic within this literature starts to diminish over time. There seems to be a growing acceptance about sort of territorial revisionism being untenable in this nuclear environment. The issue now, there's another proposition from this that derives from this, or observable issue derived from this, about the security dilemma being mitigated. And in this case, I find it striking that this is not at all true within Pakistan, that there still is really heightened belief that any Indian armaments of any sort for ostensibly to balance China or for its own sort of internal upgrades, modernization, whatever, those are always perceived as direct threats to Pakistan, not just direct threats, but destabilizing to Pakistan. So this is one clear instance where there's a major departure from the propositions of the nuclear revolution, right? The size of India's nuclear arsenal and its operational deployment would transform it into a threatening first strike force. So both on sort of the nuclear side, just in terms of numbers, these seem to somehow, in terms of whether it's quantity or quality, seem to affect Pakistan's concept of its deterrence ability. And then even on the conventional side, the huge Indian conventional military advantage and its rising economic diplomatic clout from the Pakistan perspective are destabilizing developments which require to be contained by different available options. So, but that said, I think for the most part, there's a decent amount of evidence about this acknowledgement of resolve favoring the defender and the status quo. There's questions that I'll leave out for right now about whether the status quo is mutually accepted or recognized, and that's something that I think comes up a lot in some of the contemporary critiques of the nuclear revolution, that it's a lot fuzzier and less agreed upon than we otherwise think. But this is one area, again, like the security dilemma is just an area where Pakistan is not subscribed to the tenets of the nuclear revolution. So on the third question about whether there's a military advantage or not, this is kind of strangely in tension with the security dilemma question, but nevertheless, there's a lot of professions that there doesn't need to be any arms racing, that there can be sort of major changes in Pakistan's force structure, and that arms control is not only acceptable, but ideal for Pakistan. So I have sort of a number of quotes here, but between nuclear rivals, strategic superiority and inferiority become irrelevant, as one can die only once. Professor Iqbal Chima writes in the IPRI journal, and this is actually, sorry, I think this is a different Chima, but nevertheless, writes that nuclear deterrence, unlike conventional one, is not decisively degraded by quantitative or qualitative disparity. So long as the state strategic arsenal is sufficient to survive a first strike, can still inflict unacceptable damage, doesn't have to match the adversary's arsenal in numbers. Again, Lieutenant Colonel Safdar talks about nuclear deterrence is not dependent on the parity of arsenals. Bokhari writes that it's not even in Pakistan's interest to emulate the Indian triad for both economic and political reasons. Again, this is 20 years ago. Today, you actually see sort of a change in behavior from Pakistan. But at the time he's writing, there's no need to develop even an air leg or a sea-based leg. That land-based missiles are perfectly sufficient to ensure secure second strike. And then while the quantity, and then Lieutenant Colonel Safdar again writes that while the quantity of nuclear weapons in the case of India and Pakistan may not have profound effects in the breakdown of mutual deterrence, the qualitative advantage that India is acquiring demands some serious consideration. So there's some question, again, some back and forth on this. I don't think this is totally consistent in terms of whether arms racing is necessary or pacing is necessary for Pakistan. There is, interestingly enough, when you look at sort of all the topics on in sort of within the nuclear corpus, a striking decline or leveling off of arms technology discussions, right? So like cyber capabilities, missile defense, space and ISR assets, defense technology and R&D and production. Like these conversations seem to either diminish or flatten rather than increase, which again suggests to me that the arms racing concerns are less salient in at least in the strategic discourse. In terms of arms control, there's an embrace of it. There's a result. Brigadier Javed writes that the resulting consequences of possible conflict dictate certain areas, possible cooperation between India and Pakistan. There's in several other writings, there's direct invocations of the Conventional Forces of Europe agreement or the Open Skies agreement. So there's a lot of discussion that arms control can be a vehicle out of this. in terms of changing military structure, I mean, there's direct invocation of Ken Waltz talking about more is not necessary when less is enough. Thereafter, adoption of nuclear deterrence as a matter of policy will ease pressure on Pakistan, which will enable her to restructure and right-size conventional military forces. Money thus saved can be utilized for developing an army with a lean, agile, high-tech force in consonance with the requirements of a modern battlefield. But others just say straight out that you can actually just reduce the force size altogether. In the Pakistan Defense Review, Yusuf writes that it may be more prudent to aim at restructuring of the forces rather than an across-the-board reduction in the size of respective forces. And then Just Paul is sort of another professor at the university, writes that Pakistan has thus concluded that nuclear weapons were the cheapest, most effective, and reliable route to national security. And that's actually, I should put it on this slide, but there's also sort of a recognition or belief that this allows for some cost efficiency, that the economy will be able to sort of be the beneficiary of nuclear weapons, that you can use as nuclear weapons as a substitute for conventional forces. And so again, sort of as a cost efficient and a replacement for trying to keep pace with India on its conventional forces. It's, as Brigadier Mirza writes, it's, enhancement of nuclear potential for Pakistan is far cheaper than conventional capabilities. So again, a belief that, you don't need to compete conventionally or strategically. This is just sort of reiteration that sort of the broader implications of this, that there's an expectation of strategic stability after nuclear acquisition on both sides. The qualitative leap by Pakistan and India from conventional and nuclear weapons has revolutionized the way South Asia needs to relate to itself. Strategic stability is sine qua non. The success of deterrence has been expertly crafted and assiduously maintained jointly by Pakistan and India. It's war which the two will either win or lose together. Okay, so in assessment, I've thrown a lot of qualitative evidence at you, but in assessment, I think that, there's these three propositions from the nuclear revolution, or three contentions. And I think that in the risk-taking, not war departments, there's a fairly high level of support within Pakistan. On this belief about resolve favoring the defender, I think it's actually a little bit mixed, and it's largely because I think despite certain professions, there's also a continuous fear of Indian armaments driving sort of insecurity for Pakistan. So the security dilemma is not nearly as mitigated as it should be, given some of the other claims that are made. But then the idea that there's not really a significant military advantage, I think there's high support. So overall, a fairly modest degree of support for the propositions of the nuclear revolution within the Pakistan strategic establishment. There's a key point of departure here that I'll flag now, and I want to find a way to sort of incorporate this earlier in the argument in the paper, and that is sort of this question of secure strike and second strike in of itself, which may condition everything that we've talked about today, which is there's a lot of questions that Pakistan raises as to whether they actually have it or not. So again, Lieutenant Colonel Safdar he's been sort of a consistent voice in this literature. He's constantly talking about sort of the merits of stalemate, of secure second strike, but also points out that it's not available at present. The present non-availability of second strike capability and subsequent lack of assurance regarding its survivability can lead to deterrence failure. And so I think this is a concern that even if Pakistan subscribes to the predictions of the theory, if it doesn't have that precondition or that scope condition of secure second strike and doesn't believe India has that as well, then all those propositions that flow from nuclear stalemate are less, are, I wouldn't say discredited entirely, because you can sort of have some confidence in some stabilizing effects, but it is certainly mitigated. Shima writes in the Margala papers in 2008 that there's an expectation that, like, in long term, 5 to 8 years, as its capacities improve, Pakistan will be compelled to shift to its CMD posture, its credible minimum deterrent posture, into a sufficient deterrence regime with an assured second strike capability. So recognizing that they don't have it yet, and this is 2008 he's writing, but maybe by 2013 to 2016 they'll have acquire a secure second strike capability. I think, though, to this day, Pakistan still raises the question of whether it's really that secure. And as Indian counterforce capabilities loom or have sort of considered to be emergent or growing, this question of secure second strike is not stable at all, and is in fact maybe never was there to begin with. Okay, so just summing up what I've talked about today, I think these expressed beliefs are modestly consistent with the nuclear revolution, but they're also consistent with some critiques that I said about still being able to compete within stalemate, or not even having stalemate to begin with. There's also a lot of questions raised about the salience of the status quo, and I didn't even get into that today, but essentially so much of the assumptions of revisionism assume sort of a stable, predictable, and clearly agreed upon status quo. And that's never the case with India and Pakistan. And the Pakistani scholars not only sort of say that outright, but they actually articulate some pretty good warrants for that. For example, there was no Potsdam or Yalta conference where the two sort of major parties agreed upon some general terms. There's never been anything like that. And consequently, the status quo has always been fairly fuzzy. So the second major sort of summing up point is that secure second strike may be a very unique condition. It might be a unique condition to the superpowers during the Cold War. It may not have even existed then. I mean, this is, I think, a lot of the work, sort of the revisionist work, or I shouldn't say, the newer work on the nuclear revolution critiques suggest that condition may not have existed in the 70s and 80s, particularly as the US improved its ISR capabilities and its ability to track mobile missiles and ballistic submarines. The third point is that the nuclear revolution debates are not exclusively the domain of the West and superpowers, that there is a fair amount of engagement with it, more than I expected going into this in the Pakistani strategic literature, and that they actually employ a fairly thoughtful, critical, and reflective approach to the theory in their discussion. So despite I think what gets said about sort of the Pakistani military is not a particularly adept learning organization, I have been surprised by how relatively sophisticated the military and strategic establishment engage with these debates. All right, and so I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your patience as I work through this. This is the first time I'm presenting this, and I really welcome feedback, criticism, comments, questions, anything you throw at me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Samir, for that amazing presentation, and we learned a lot today. And I have a lot of questions, but I want to just tell everyone that we'll be using the remaining time for question Q&A. You can either raise your hand using the tab in the participants section, or you can message on the chat, or you can also message me directly if you want to remain anonymous, and I can raise your question to the group. So first up, we have Tyler. Tyler, you're able to unmute yourself. So if you just want to go ahead and ask your question.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So this was fantastic. I really enjoyed this presentation. Thanks so much for sharing it. I think the methodological approach is awesome, super interesting. I guess there's two reactions that I had, both responding to feedback that you had sort of requested in the presentation. So in terms of framing this theoretically, like the descriptive contribution here is so important that it might not even be necessary to do this, but the immediate thing that jumps out at me is on that final slide, or close to the end, you have the variation in the three subcomponents of the nuclear revolution. And I wonder if the theoretical contribution is trying to understand the conditions under which we observe that variation. In other words, theorizing why that second component of the nuclear revolution and the beliefs about the nuclear revolution is not observed in the Pakistani case. And it seems like what you're driving at least in my read of it, is that this has something to do with a continuous fear of India and potentially the security of the Pakistani second strike capability. And so if one were to try to test that, you have two, in my mind, really interesting sources of variation within your corpus already, which you could try to leverage in order to test that. Namely, you have temporal variation. So one could imagine trying to set up the analysis for some kind of comparison in periods of Indian capabilities relative to Pakistan's, and see whether or not that affects whether or not authors are expressing belief in the second component of the nuclear revolution. But then you could also imagine structuring the analysis such that you leverage variation between authors. So presumably some of these authors do agree with that second proposition of the nuclear revolution. And what I think you would be looking for is what characteristics of those individuals that do believe it are salient. So you could do it either inductively, and actually, just to clarify, I don't mean like a regression that looks at civil military differences. What I guess I was envisioning is something like establishing through the corpus whether or not those same individuals express a high deal of confidence in secure second strike and or fear of India. And presumably, if the hypothesis were correct, what you would find is that individuals that feared second strike or the lack of a second strike capability or feared India would be less likely to express that second tenet of the nuclear revolution as a belief. Okay, so that's my thought on framing / theory. The second point is like very small and methodological, and I know everyone hates methods, things in these kinds of talks, but I guess I was wondering whether or not it seems like such a shame that you have this very rich corpus and you're not leveraging it more quantitatively. I love the qualitative analysis, but the sort of just funneling down into a qualitative analysis is, I think, isn't necessarily as compelling. One thing that you could do if you're sort of worried about the topic model being able to extract out topics that you think are conceptually robust is, I think it's Hoske has a new R package called Keyword Assisted Topic Models, KeyATM. You probably have heard of this already. But it essentially allows you to, in a structured way, specify a set of terms and or snippets of text which you think exhibit a certain idea, and then feed them into the topic model. So you are deductively, as opposed to inductively, identifying topics. In any case, again, great presentation. Thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you, Tyler. Those are really great suggestions. Yeah, specifically the second one. I mean, I don't think by any means we've made as much use of this as we've intended to, and part of the reason for like drilling down to this sort of sub corpus is because there are I think multiple papers or chapters for other projects that will sort of exploit the entirety of it. But this suggestion for QATM is a really great one, and I think ultimately we would like to do some more machine learning and sort of coding of articles and then applying it to the larger corpus for more sentiment analysis, but just haven't got to it yet, but definitely on the list of things to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. I have Reed next. So Reed, if you want to just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Samir. Thanks so much for doing this. Very exciting project. I've got a couple comments and questions. So because it's so exciting, I'll try to be short. But I guess a brief comment would be that on the way you're presenting the data, it's very hard for me to understand and interpret a frequency table if there's no comparison to another nuclear power, right? Like I don't know what you would find in American journals over time about the frequency of deterrence versus war winning. I mean, basically, the point would be, it wouldn't be that surprising to me to see more mentions of deterrence and war winning, even in a country like the United States, which we're now realizing has never embraced the nuclear revolution, has tried to escape from it constantly. Yet at the same time, we're going to talk about deterrence a lot. So I don't know how to interpret those, but it's much more compelling than if you can tell a story about changes over time in that data, and a little more about historical context, as you started to in some cases. So then my questions are about the first of variable resource constraints. I think your kind of counterfactual idea here is that if Pakistan actually was capable of trying to escape MAD by devoting a lot of resources to counterforce capability, you think that they wouldn't do that? I mean, I think we're seeing, on the other side, right, that Vipin and Chris are showing that India is trying to put resources towards counterforce, and they're tempted to do so. And it would not be that surprising to see Pakistan doing that if they didn't have more severe resource constraints. So what about the variable resource constraints? Does anyone mention that in this work? And then just what do you think as an analyst here, Does PAN have a secure strike capability in your opinion? Thanks.
Okay, yeah. So point taken about frequency tables. And yeah, I think you're right to leverage it more by talking about variation over time. I mean, I have thought about sort of trying to do sort of a similar quick sort of sweep of like actually, we think we did a long time ago, did a very basic modeling of like IS or something like that. But we'll think more about how to present that in a more compelling way. On the resource constraints, yeah, so like in theory, every country is resource constrained, right? They have commitments and responsibilities to domestic priorities. You basically say like, even the United States in theory there's always sort of a pushback against sort of domestic versus sort of foreign policy priorities. Every other country sort of in the second nuclear age is effectively a developing country. And so there are always inherent trade-offs. And I guess the question I think that's surprising to me is that even that I think it's surprising that they would even suggest that you have sufficiency, right? Like that the mere hint that you're sufficient in certain capability, despite you could argue are much more existential threats than the United States, I think is actually quite surprising. And it's actually uncommon. It's the literature on Pakistan, tends to sort of say that like there's always threat inflation. There's always sort of an overestimation of the threat. And so, and I don't think I framed this well, but I think it is really striking when you have a fair number of authors saying actually the threat is manageable given sort of this new capability in a way that I know I wasn't expecting that to be there. So I think I'll have to sort of think about how I frame that. You guess the question, you're right, if you remove that constraint of resources, then do they sort of go all out and maximize security? I mean, I think most likely yes, but again, I think that's a more important. It's like it's a structural condition like anarchy, right? Like just because it doesn't vary doesn't mean it's not important. So in this case, I think the sort of the perpetual demands of domestic priorities in sort of a developing country are always going to sort of be that precondition. And so attending to it in some ways and sort of acknowledging that there are other priorities, because is definitely counterintuitive for the Pakistan strategic establishment. On the second point, shoot, remind me, what was the one after the resource constraints issue?
I don't know if Pakistan has a secure second.
Yeah, okay.
In your judgment.
Yeah, so I think it does now. And I think it does now without, and this is just my personal belief, I don't think it needs a sea-based deterrent for it to have secure second strike. I think if it has enough mobile missiles and is still geographically diverse and dispersed, that it can achieve, it can sort of ensure secure second strike. I think it's plausible that early on, like, when you were talking sort of like, 10s and 20s of weapons, there was a case to be made that they didn't have secure second strike. And then sort of, diversity of some diversity of delivery platforms. But I think they have it today. And so I think, but then, this is the question that sort of gets brought up by, I think, some of the contemporary critiques, but it's a dynamic situation. It's not simply what you have. It's also like how advanced your adversary's capabilities are in sort of finding and fixing targets, right? And so I think that is also that's the part of the ledger that you were alluding to, like that Clary and Narang are discussing, which is it's not really like enhancements in raw numbers of Indian capabilities. It's just precision and ISR. So I think I understand why they would sort of make the claim, but I think on face I think they have a secure second strike.
We have another question by Sitara. Hi, Sitara. Please go ahead, ask your question.
Vinesh, it's fascinating discussion, Samir. And I just have a quick question. To what extent do you think this analysis is reflective of the research ideas that you have picked up? How much, to what an extent they are reflective of the official policy or the official position? How much from these you can read into the official position on the different steps that you have identified and the official policy at certain time period that at the time when they were written.
Yeah. Well, so look, I agree that it's certainly not the same quality as archival evidence, right? Because these are not people writing in, although there's some occasions where they're actually sort of in service and writing about things. Like there's several of these quotes I pulled and cited are people who are actually serving in describing, in making an assessment that's related to the job that they're doing. So it's not the same as archival evidence, but I think it's our best proxy in Pakistan outside of sort of direct interview evidence. But then there's incentives to conceal or sort of mislead, and so I'm acknowledging that it's not great, but it's a lot better than I think anything else we have out there, sort of on the Pakistan strategic establishment in terms of, as I said, sort of a private discourse that sort of maybe has sort of revealed sort of beliefs. So that's my approximate assessment. And do you think differently?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in saying that sometimes some information is given out in this way, but I also think that it's not really correct to read too much into what comes not only through these meetings, but all through these writings, but also some of the results that are derived through certain exercises or war gamings and stuff like that. Because although some of the officials who had actually taken part in the official decision making, probably once they are on job and once they are out of it, they probably want to reflect a different message than actually was the position when they were actually holding certain important decision-making positions. So one has to be wary of this situation, particularly in an environment where a country like Pakistan works and operates. That's just wanted to add to that.
No, I fully agree with that, and I think in the paper I'm going to try to write sort of. There's lots of footnotes to all of this stuff, but that's definitely one of the points. But that's why I also think this is better than a lot of memoirs, right? Because the other sort of source that we rely upon is either interview evidence or memoirs, and those are even sort of more vulnerable to post hoc corrections or sort of curve fitting a policy. And so at least with this, and particularly I think when we're talking about the early 2000s, sort of late 90s, early 2000s period, right after the nuclear tests, when there's a lot in flux and there's a lot being discussed and debated, that there might be you might find more kernels of truth within that than especially today when, I think there's a lot of people with their backs against the wall or sort of just being more conscious of, as you said, sort of how they behave or act or what they say sort of being interpreted in certain ways. And so I will say that I do think that this literature is limited in what it can sort of offer us into the future, because I think there's effectively been, I think since Chris Fair's book, there's been a correction essentially, and that there's been sort of a lot more attention to making sure that everything post the publication of that book is, sort of more cosmopolitan and sort of embraces sort of a variety of views. But I do think there's a period, prior to that when we can sort of evaluate some beliefs that are maybe more accurate, and then again compare that to behavior. I mean, ultimately, this is the goal is sort of look at expressed beliefs and see whether and how and whether or not they correspond to particular behavior. So that's definitely a check that I need to incorporate as well.
Thanks, Atara, for that question. Next, we have Ariel. If you want to introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Sure. Hi, Samir. This is Ariel Petrovich. I'm a postdoc at Harvard's Belfer Center, and Sana graciously invited me. So I was really curious to see this work. I think this is a really great compilation and a really good example of how we can use data in a way that we didn't have access to before. So I really enjoyed seeing this as a work in progress. I also, as an aside, really enjoyed your reference to 13 Days. It's a highly underquoted movie, so definitely I suggest keeping at it. So my question is actually, how much of this basically primacy of deterrence over war fighting and war winning that you saw is in part potentially because Pakistan is a conventionally inferior nuclear state, and one that got a lot of pushback for its weapons program in the post-NPT world. So in other words, how much does this seem to reflect the US, for example, and is there, sorry, that's my baby in the background. There also seems to be basically a great deal of reference in the US, especially today, to war winning with nuclear weapons as opposed to simply deterrence. So I'm wondering what kind of conditions encourage a primacy of deterrence over war fighting and winning, or do you think this is more universal and we just we haven't captured it yet because we haven't been looking at it this way before? And thank you.
I think you're right that, I mean, this is the most this should be one of the most likely cases of where deterrence should be seen as sort of the optimal strategy over war fighting. So I guess it's, again, there's a lot of low bars here. But I would say that like Pakistan is the Pakistani military, and like in other writings, and this is certainly, again, like one of the arguments from Chris Fair is that they're still fairly bullish about their conventional warfighting capabilities, despite history and experience. And so there is something to sort of be asked, like, you know, whether it's not cheap for them to sort of give that up. It's not easy for them to sort of say that. And I think for any professional military organization, regardless of whether, you know, you're small or weak, I mean, this is, I think I probably should draw this in. This is a really good reminder, but like, you know, Posen's, I think he has this really elegant summary of like the different types of doctrines, whether like offense, defense, and deterrence. And like, essentially, you know, offense is like, it's what militaries want to do because that's what they're planners, and they sort of take initiative. And I think the discussion of like, you know, the strategies of deterrence is essentially like, you know, you become sort of experts in slaughter. But also it's not like, there's not a lot of sort of tactical prowess to it in a particular way. So I think it is still hard. So on the one hand, while the state as a whole is most likely to accede to these proposition, the institution or the organization of the military is probably the least likely to embrace it. And so maybe I should frame it in those terms. That makes it like kind of an interesting question. But you're right. I mean, I think the harder test on this overall would be for a country like India that has sort of conventional advantage to see whether they think about, at least with respect to Pakistan, whether deterrence is sort of optimal over war fighting. And certainly there's mixed evidence about that, again, that was alluded to earlier. So, thanks. This is good reminder that I should frame it in those terms. I think it's a little sharper.
And actually, to be clear, I do think it actually is a very interesting finding that you find that military commanders in particular in Pakistan actually do seem to favor deterrence rhetoric over warfighting and war winning rhetoric with nuclear weapons. I'm just wondering how much we can sort of extrapolate from that to other cases. And I mean, the Pakistan case alone, there's not that many nuclear states. So the Pakistan case alone is interesting enough, even on its own. But I think that it could almost be interesting if you could apply this in other cases to see sort of what conditions might encourage that, you know, the primacy of one over another, if it isn't reflected everywhere.
Right. That's a good point.
Thanks, Ariel, for that excellent question. And now I'll have Sane ask her question. And if anyone else in the meantime has a question, please raise your hand or just message us in the chat. Sane, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for a fascinating talk. It's really, really great to see this. And it was very well presented too. It's often hard to present this type of data. So fantastic job. I think I have like three smaller questions. So the first one is, so who gets to publish in these journals? Like which parts of the military, which part of the civilian bureaucracy is actually publishing, and how representative are those pieces of the broader population within each of these organizations? And then the second question is, so at the end, you kind of aggregate up those three dimensions. So how do we decide how do we aggregate those three up is my second question, to like come to the moderate support that you then end up finding. And then the third one is kind of whether in these particular articles and whether the scholars and the military officers say anything about posture preferences and what they think Pakistani posture should look like, and in general whether there is a link between these kinds of theoretical exercises and strategic doctrinal exercises and the posturing of Pakistan. But thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. So who gets to publish in these journals? I don't know sort of the full history of it, but like in contemporary time, like, you know, periods, like it's actually quite open. And again, I'm not sure if this is a correction over the last few years, but like in recent years, for example, the Army Green Book, which was considered to be, you know, like sort of very exclusive domain of the Army and sort of the apex publication. I actually don't think it is. I think the Citadel is the apex publication because it's a command and staff college, and so that's a lot more selective in terms of who publishes from it. But today there's civilians on the editorial board of the Army Green Book. They contribute to articles and write articles in it. And even historically, I think there were, you know, periodically civilian contributors. So, but I don't know quite sort of what the mechanism for like the filtration process is for who gets to and who doesn't. I would say that like there's a lot of contributors to these publications who they're part of the strategic community writ large. And so I'm not sure if the selection process is like there's obstructions to it. There's probably like, you know, obstructions to sort of entering, being part of the community to begin with. But then once you enter in, I'm not sure if there's like significant, you know, obstacles beyond that point. But that's a good question that I should probably ask around a little bit about. I mean, I remember reading, it was like on a LinkedIn page, like the editor of one of these journals sort of describing like the number of articles that come in and sort of the amount of sort of submissions versus acceptances, something like that. But it's, yeah, there's not, I probably need to sort of do a little bit more to describe some of these journals. In terms of representative population, I mean, it's definitely Army heavy, but that's sort of the military is Army heavy, but there are distinct journals for the Navy and for the Air Force. And as I said, for sort of the think tank community, which then sort of is much more civilian leaning. So it doesn't represent, you know, Pakistan population as a whole, but I wouldn't be surprised if we did a sort of a little bit of math and looked at like, at least in terms of the services, I would be willing to bet that the distribution of articles, authors by service, or reflects maybe like the distribution of the budget or something like that, military budget. I think that would be a reasonable contention. On the aggregation question, like, yeah, there was a lot of thought put into that, right? It was like, well, because even these questions, like how much do they adhere to this? It's like, yes, they do or they don't, or there's debate over it. So I don't think those are not clean at all. And there's not a lot of science to it, or just high, low, medium. So if you have suggestions for how I should think about it, or if there are other work that you've seen that sort of tries to make sense of this, maybe I just have to think a little bit more rigorously about how to measure adherence, you know, because right now I'm setting the bar low of expression rather than adherence, and so that's a tougher question, and I'm not sure how I would aggregate that. And maybe it doesn't make sense to. I was trying to sort of have some way of summing this up, but maybe that's not the best way to do it. And the last thing about posture preferences. This is a good question because I think posture then sort of, you know, incorporates there's a lot of sort of pieces to that. Certainly there's a lot of conversations about numbers, and there's a lot of conversations about, again, whether, you know, tactical or strategic. And then I think you can sort of, from that, you'd sort of come up with a matrix of postures potentially. But I only think like recently, then there's a whole sort of batch of discussions that are like full spectrum deterrence versus credible minimum deterrence, but then like what the components of that are pretty ambiguous too. So I think they exist. I just don't think they're coherent. Let's put it that way. I think there's a lot of discussions of posture, but there's not sort of consistency and coherence across sort of like what we're talking about as being the same thing when we talk about posture, at least in this literature from what I've read. But that, again, is something that I'm open to being told differently on. So that's just my impression.
Thank you for your question, Sane. We have a few questions in the chat if you want to quickly address them. One of them is by Walker Cruson. He says, I understand the primary topic is Pakistan's nuclear capability, but why is this topic considered seemingly only in the context of India and not with other adversaries, particularly Israel? And then there's another question, which is super quick too. Like, is there any, thank you for a great talk. Is there any book you would recommend on this topic for people wanting to learn more about it?
Yeah, okay, so on the first question of Pakistan's nuclear capability in regards to India, I mean, I think that's just how Pakistan's strategic community defines like its sort of only real deterrent challenge as India. I mean, the role of Israel, I think, I don't know where to go with this. There's some discussion that like maybe Israel could be sort of a future adversary. Right? There was consideration that Israel was helping India during the 80s and potentially doing sort of an Osiris kind of strike on Pakistan. So maybe it considered an adversary, but it's so distant, it's never actually been involved in like any potential competition. I mean, there's hostility towards Israel, like the way there is expressed by a lot of countries that have sort of sided with the Palestinian cause. And then recently there have been concerns about Pakistan's sort of longer range missiles being able to potentially range Israel. So, so I'll say I understand why you're asking the question, but I will say that I don't think any of the literature really engages with it. So that's why I bounded my discussion to sort of the nuclear capability vis-a-vis India. If that was to change, then I think I would have to think about this a little bit differently. But like, you know, even like in a lot of sort of Western discourse on Pakistan's nuclear capabilities, there's oftentimes sort of these allusions to the possibility for extended deterrence to Saudi Arabia, or sort of potential for nuclear transfer to Saudi Arabia. I mean, like, that doesn't get engaged at all with in at least Pakistan's own strategic public discourse, or even in this private discourse. So I think it's either it's so secretive or high level that it's not going to sort of appear here, or it's just too distant in terms of the actual strategic concerns of the Pakistan community. In terms of books on this, I mean, wow, where to begin? There's a lot. Like if you're looking sort of in terms of strategic discourse applied to Pakistan, I do think Chris Baer's book is excellent, and at least sort of it became sort of a useful template for me. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that I disagreed with when I read the book, but that was what prompted this project, is to sort of really, I think there's a lot more variation both over time and sort of across sort of issue sets that I had encountered in these journals, which is sort of what led to like the motivation for doing sort of topic analysis or sort of topic modeling, because I do think it allows you to sort of excavate sort of that tremendous diversity. I mean, I didn't show a slide on this, but like, you know, the number of topics, and the majority of what goes on in these publications is actually talking about just military professionalism. It's what you would expect of a normal military, that talks about leadership, operations, and sort of some tactical elements and infantry tactics, and then a lot about sort of like what it means to sort of be a soldier, an officer, the responsibilities that come with that in terms of training and evaluation and stuff. So it's like really banal military stuff, which is not surprising for military journals, but the way sometimes it's discussed as if like these journals are like mostly the haven for plots against India, when, you know, there's a decent amount of concern about India, but like it's not the end all be all of the strategic discourse. I mean, in terms of, you know, broader suggestions for like, you know, the nuclear revolution stuff, I guess if that's sort of the angle that the question was oriented towards, I mean, obviously Jervis's nuclear revolution, but then the recent critiques I think are actually really good in some ways at in some ways doing a better job of laying out what the hypotheses of the nuclear revolution are, because as the authors like Brendan Green and Austin Long rightly point out, that a lot of this stuff was like a combination of prescription as well as description of sort of what this new revolution was, right? And so, and that prescriptiveness, I think, sort of infects some of the judgments or the empirical analysis of this. And so that's where I think sort of Green's new, I actually have them right here as a reference them. So The Revolution That Failed, it's a pretty good book, and it's really, really artful into the opening chapters of sort of laying out these propositions. And then this one by Kira Lieber and Dell Press, I think is quite useful. And you know, there's probably plenty more. I would say Reed Polly should probably be answering this question more than I about sort of that material. But that's what I got for those questions. I don't have any more.
Great, thank you so much, Samir. We have Omar wanting to ask a question next. Omar, do you want to just unmute yourself?
Sorry, yeah. Thank you for such a great talk. Really interesting, something that I'm quite interested in for my own work as well. I was just curious to hear from you, like, as you were going through these different journals and all, whether specifically with regard to nuclear weapons, nuclear revolution, strategic weapons, but also just generally, if there was any particular significant intra-services divergence you came across, specifically between, I imagine the Navy is not really involved here, but specifically between the Army and the Air Force, because, and I might be wrong about this, but my impression is that a lot of these journals, especially those coming from NDU, Margala papers, the NDU journal, usually Army men are contributing, and usually they're the ones who are sitting on the editorial board as well. So I was just curious to hear if there were any particular divergences and variations you came across.
That's a good question. I should go back because like I unless like the rank is sort of like very distinct, I sometimes like discount like, whether looking, whether the lieutenant colonel is an Air Force officer or an Army officer. I should probably go back and take a look at some of that. I mean, just anecdotally from what I quoted you, I mean, some of the what I would say sort of the strongest adherence and expressions of adherence to the nuclear revolution do, I think, come from some of the other services, not exclusively, or they come from like the more cerebral aspects of it, I guess, right? Like, so like people who go on to sort of become heads of the ISI or sort of serve in the ISI, I do think have a more cerebral take on the utility and sort of the utility and limits of nuclear weapons. I'm sort of this very, very anecdotally because I haven't sort of systematically looked at this, but that's a good question to ask. And I think that's one that I'll probably, you've just given me a new angle to think about this as to whether there's sort of inter-service variation or even sort of specialization that makes one predisposed to be more inclined or less inclined, right? Because like for infantrymen, it's profoundly disempowering to not be able to sort of think about being able to sort of seize Siachen, right? Like so you're right. I think that you theoretically should expect that based on sort of what the just by sort of parochial interests, and so I think that's definitely a proposition I intend to test. So thank you for suggesting that.
Thank you.
Related to that, before we end, I think I have a related question to that, and as well as what Sane was saying about, whose beliefs are you really measuring? What does that tell you about whose beliefs matter? This is personally a question I'm interested in terms of like when you say leaders matter, who is the leader that you're thinking about? And like more of my own research interest is like what informs those beliefs? Is it variables related to the strategic environment, which has, if you think about the threat perception that you were talking about, which has remained pretty constant, is it the technological aspects that drive it, like technological advancements that are changing people's views? Or the variable I am more interested in looking at is leadership in terms of the adversary as well. So do you see any changes in these beliefs over time in the Pakistani context, and what are those changes related to? What's causing people to change that? And I think I want to ask if you saw any sort of trends with Modi's leadership and sort of his rhetoric and nationalism, and then Reid kind of raised this question about India's policy, right? And how do changes on or anticipated changes or like alleged changes in India's policies and doctrine, and even recently we now see debates about the first use policy being contested, and even though there's no direct like answer for that right now, but I do believe that it creates an ambivalence around what the actual doctrine is. And how do you see those kinds of changes changing how Pakistanis are reading the situation? So I think I really would like to learn more about that. And then a related aspect, and you kind of talk about it in your the graphs that you were showing, were about the incorporation of emerging technologies like cyber and AI, and how do they impact strategic deterrence calculations on both sides. And in the literature there's obviously different camps. There's the more optimistic camp, which says that both countries' defenses and security can benefit in many ways, including, improvements to their command and control, early warning systems, their surveillance, reconnaissance, physical security. But then there's also the more pessimistic view, right? That these same capabilities could potentially cast a doubt on the survivability of their respective second strike capabilities, which is a big part of what you've been referring to as well. And this could lead to a more aggressive nuclear posture. So which view do you personally align with, having viewed this data? Like, how do you think the Pakistanis are like looking at reading these changes with emerging technology like cyber and AI? I'll be interested in that. And lastly, very quickly, in reading this qualitative data, what do you think is like a most likely scenario or paths to deterrence failure in South Asia from the Pakistani perspective?
Wow. Okay.
Sorry, I know I saved it all for the end, but this was a great presentation, something I'm personally interested in. So yeah.
Well, I think this is definitely a conversation we want to continue. I'll do my best to take on some of this. So I'll separate out sort of what, the literature that I'm dealing with from sort of my own beliefs, or sort of beliefs that are sort of informed from a broader set of observations, as opposed to just this project and this literature. Because I think a lot of what you've asked about is sort of kind of outside the scope of the presentation today. There's just not a lot of discussion. I mean, so number one, I mean, the data set ends in 2017. And if you think about sort of the gestation of a journal article, right, like at least a year. And so there's a little bit about sort of like the Modi and sort of like the changing sort of political configuration within India, but that's not as salient as it's obviously in contemporary discourse, or that would be captured in contemporary news articles or whatever. And same with sort of discussions of like sort of these advanced or emerging technologies. I mean, there's so little discussion of electronic warfare, which is like a 1990s technology. And that's actually, that's probably another paper to be written, is sort of like the dearth of discussion on this. I'm not sure if there are other venues where you would expect greater engagement with this, but my suspicion is that, and this might sort of reveal sort of what these articles are for, but the predominance of army and infantry, particularly both in sort of the military as a whole, but then also in terms of contributing to this discourse, there's just not a lot of sort of engagement with more advanced technologies. Or if it is, it's sort of like it's a hand wave, like, and we got to be doing better at this. We need to buy some more of that cyber kind of stuff, rather than grappling with the questions that you raised, which are much more sophisticated about sort of what is the offense-defense balance, or how does it affect the offense-defense balance, or for example, the cost exchange ratio between in competition with an adversary that's more sort of powerful. But like, so you asked the first question about the change over time, and there is something, whether it varies about sort of under sort of different sort of background conditions. So I think one is temporal, and something that Tyler alluded to, and I will try to do more with that. I think there's something, it's what you would expect, but it's also something that's worth drawing out. But I do think there is a change after 1998. Number one, as I pointed out in sort of that the graphs, like there's an explosion in the discussion of strategy that was absent prior to it. Maybe that's intuitive and obvious, but I think it's significant that most of that conversation happens in the post 1998 period. I mean, the other part that I think has always been interesting to me is the wax and wane of the conversations about Kashmir. And Kashmir is sort of a proxy for a broader sort of territorial dispute with India, and not just within the nuclear literature. It reflects sort of the broader trend in the entire corpus we have, which is that there's a steady increase in the 90s, and that sort of I think has largely related to the fact that there's an insurgency in the Kashmir Valley in the 1990s, and it kind of like peaks around the early 2000s, but then steadily declines for a period of time. And I think there's a lot of things happening in the world going on with that. I mean, one is that there are two major crises that have occurred. So this could be sort of like the post-Cuban Missile Crisis learning period, which is also correlated with sort of a process of confidence building measures that are taking place between India and Pakistan on the ground, and a comprehensive, peace discussion that's going on, territorial conflict resolution discussions that are going from 2003 to 2008. So all those things are correlated. It's maybe hard to unpack, but it is significant that discourse reflects it. And I've always used this to say, when people make the argument that like Musharraf's 7 points 4 points was not a real credible offer, I was like, well, empirically, this could tell us something about it. Like if these ideas trickle down, or really the absence of discussion, I think the absence is revealing there's not a lot of drum banging about like Kashmir during this time, despite the fact that, you know, it's still a pretty bad situation. So I think there's something to that. And I don't quite, there's more to empirically sort of test a little bit tighter, but I think there's something there. The other sort of salient point that I'll make that, again, it's anecdotal as I'm pulling these articles and sort of looking to, because I read the article first, and then I go back and sort of see who the author is and try to identify, you know, where their backgrounds. There's always little biographies for a lot of these folks. A lot of them that I think sort of expressed a greater sentiment towards these concepts of deterrence, stability, and, you know, the salutary effects of nuclear weapons on you know, mitigating this, not the security dilemma, but like, you know, the need for sort of arms racing, all that stuff. Like, strangely enough, a lot of these folks, I think, tend to have gone to a war college in the United States or the UK. Again, I'm talking about like a handful of observations, so I'm not sure if this is sort of a structural thing, but that's me. And now, does that mean it affects their sentiment, or does it even sort of affect like the selection into this topic in the first place? I think it's possible both. But that was something that I thought was really interesting to reflect on. One I will also like to look a little more closely at, because it's possible that sort of this contact or exposure to a wider set of discussions about, you know, the range of possibilities with nuclear weapons could be then influencing how they discuss this. So yeah, so I think it's possible that you're right, that the external environments and sort of external conditions are shaping a lot of this discourse. And I hope they would be connected. Otherwise, it would sort of, if they're totally untethered, then I think that sort of makes this be less useful material. But the fact that they are related, I think, is important. Yeah, so I think I've talked about it a little bit. I say, like, you know, my impression, I think there are a lot of other folks on this call who could probably talk more about what's changed in the last 2-3 years post sort of the end of this data set. But yeah, I mean, I do think there's a recognition from my sense that like emerging technologies are going to be material and matter, and they're related to economic development, and not really development, but sort of like the wealth of a country and the ability to sort of invest in, you know, R&D and technology, and that's going to sort of be much more decisive than, you know, raw numbers of firepower or troop levels or things like that. So, or even clever strategy. So I do think there's a recognition of that, but I don't think there's been sort of a detailed discussion of, you know, what that requires in terms of investments for the future. And maybe that's just because, like, you know, with a finite budget and a declining economy, Pakistan doesn't have the luxury of sort of making those kinds of investments. Simply sort of holding steady is really the best you can hope for. On the question of sort of what's happening within India, yeah, it does seem to be intensifying threat perceptions. And I'm not what I hear is that when you discuss sort of like the stability of deterrence, it's never just the military modernization aspects of it, right? And in fact, when you look at the number, like India claims to be doing a lot of things, what it's actually doing is far more limited, right? Like if you look at its budget numbers versus what it actually spends on like new acquisitions or modern technologies, it is a pretty big gap, right? Like I saw recently a reference to Indian sort of new acquisitions of Russian fighters. Those were like MiG-21 Bisons, like 3.5 generation fighters, or at best 4th generation fighters when they're buying some new Su-29s, Su-30s. So like there's a big gulf between that, but it's always conditioned by this other aspect of there's a rising ideological element within India that makes everything much more fraught. It's not just capabilities, it's about sort of that interaction between capabilities and sort of the shift in the balance of power, along with some sort of ideological tint, whether that's sort of, you know, territorial aggrandizement, something about you know, marginalizing Muslims in the subcontinent writ large. There's definitely some sort of interaction going on there, and I'm not sure if that's for rhetorical effect, because that could be a strategy, or if there's actually something deeply fearful about that combination. But they definitely have noticed that in recent years. So
then the only thing, just that remains is thanking you, Samir, for a fantastic talk, super interesting work, and for the audience for asking such great questions and starting such a wonderful discussion. So please join me in thanking Samir, and thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you so much,
Really enjoyed this
Samir.
and appreciate it.